Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling something that's been a hot topic lately, even as things are cooling down a bit. We're talking about inflation and how we think about it sometimes, maybe not so rationally. And to help us unpack this, we're going to dig into a pretty fascinating idea called Kartik's law of inflation.
Yeah, it's interesting how economics is supposed to be all about numbers and logic, right? But it seems like we humans can't help but bring our emotions into it.
Absolutely, and that's where Kartik comes in. He's this brilliant guy who's got a real knack for both tech and economics. And let me tell you, he's been nailing his inflation predictions. But it's what he's observed about the way people talk about inflation online that really caught my eye.
Oh, yeah? What's that?
So he noticed this weird pattern, no matter what the online conversation was about, kids, the latest meme, some serious news story, anything, it would always somehow spiral into someone claiming that inflation is the root of all evil.
Oh, wow, like clockwork, huh?
Exactly, like clockwork. He even compares it to Godwin's law. You know that internet thing that says the longer an online discussion goes on, the more likely it is that someone will bring up Nazis?
Ah, yeah, Godwin's law, right? The idea that online discussions tend to devolve into these extreme comparisons.
So is Kartik basically saying that inflation is like the new Godwin's law?
Pretty much, yeah. It's become this default explanation for everything wrong in the world, even when the data doesn't really back it up.
Okay, so let's get to the heart of it. Why are people so obsessed with inflation? Why all the fear and anxiety, even when things are starting to cool down?
Well, Kartik's got this kind of bold theory. He calls it an inflation cult. He thinks people are irrationally fearing inflation, like it's this all-powerful evil force out to get them.
A cult. Wow, that's a strong word, but I can kind of see what he means. It's like people are treating inflation as this monster under the bed, ready to gobble up all their savings.
It's a bit like being afraid of gravity. Gravity can be harmful in certain situations, right? But it's also essential for life on Earth. It's a neutral force. And just like gravity, inflation can have both positive and negative effects. It's not inherently good or bad.
That's a great analogy. So if we can agree that inflation isn't inherently evil, why all the fear and anxiety? Why do people freak out so much about it?
Well, one reason is that it's often used as a scapegoat. It's much easier to blame external forces like inflation for our own struggles or failures than to take responsibility for our own choices.
You mean like instead of admitting maybe we overspend or made some bad financial decisions, it's more comforting to just blame it on inflation, like it's this big bad monster eating away at our money?
Exactly. Think about it. Someone who's struggling to save money might blame inflation for eroding their purchasing power, but maybe they haven't really taken a good look at their own spending habits, which could be the real culprit.
Right? It's like using inflation as a shield to avoid dealing with tougher personal issues.
Precisely. And what's interesting is that Kartik's identified like 8 common ways people exhibit this irrationality around inflation, and some of them are surprisingly relatable. You've probably heard these arguments yourself.
Oh, I'm sure we all have these misconceptions are everywhere. But let's break down a few specific examples, the ones that really highlight this irrationality.
Okay, sure. Let's start with a classic, the belief that inflation is always bad and deflation is always good. It sounds logical at first glance, but it's actually way more complicated than that.
Yeah, deflation, which is essentially prices going down, might sound like a dream come true. Who doesn't want things to be cheaper? But it can actually be a nightmare for the economy as a whole.
Exactly. Imagine if people constantly expect prices to keep falling, they'll put off buying things, businesses will hold back on investments, and the whole economy can just grind to a halt.
It's like waiting for those Black Friday deals all year round. Sure, you might snag a slightly better price eventually, but in the meantime, businesses suffer, jobs are lost, and everyone loses out in the long run.
That's a great way to put it. So you see, deflation can be just as damaging as out of control inflation.
Okay, deflation is not the answer. Got it. Now, another common misconception, especially here in the U.S., is this idea that the U.S. is the only country experiencing inflation.
Ah, yes. The classic US-centric view of the world. It's like people forget there's a whole planet out there dealing with economic challenges.
Right. It's like inflation is this uniquely American problem, but that's simply not true.
Think about a country like Argentina. They've been battling crazy high inflation for years. Or Venezuela, where hyperinflation has just wrecked their economy.
Yeah, that puts things into perspective. The U.S. has its economic issues for sure, but inflation isn't some unique American curse. It's a global thing with varying degrees of intensity in different countries.
And that brings us to another interesting point, this tendency to romanticize the past, the whole things were better 50 years ago argument.
The nostalgia trap. It's so easier to fall into that thinking. Everything seems simpler and more affordable in the good old days, right? But is that really true?
Well, let's look at some concrete examples. 50 years ago, life-saving medical treatments like organ transplants or effective cancer therapies were either unavailable or incredibly expensive. Today, thanks to medical advancements, millions of people have access to these life-saving treatments.
That's true. I hadn't thought about it that way.
Or consider communication technology. 50 years ago, international calls were a luxury and the internet didn't even exist. Today, we can connect with loved ones across the globe instantly and access information at our fingertips.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in the nostalgia, but objectively, life has improved in many ways over the past 50 years.
Exactly. And those improvements are often overlooked when people are fixated on the perceived negatives of inflation. It's a classic case of cherry-picking data to fit a narrative.
So we need to take a more balanced view of history. We can't just focus on the good old days and ignore the progress we've made.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Kartik's main point. People often react to inflation emotionally, not logically.
This is so eye-opening. It's like we're peeling back the layers of this inflation obsession and seeing the deeper psychological and social forces at play.
It's all connected, and the implications go far beyond economics. It really makes you wonder, how can we have more rational and evidence-based discussions about complex issues, not just inflation, but anything?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think Kartik's law of inflation gives us some valuable clues about tackling that challenge.
It definitely does. And if Kartik's right, this exaggerated fear of inflation might eventually fade away, just like those myths surrounding Satan and the patriarchy crumbled under scrutiny.
Wow, that's a bold prediction. I'm really curious to hear more about why he thinks that'll happen.
Let's dive into that after a quick break. We'll be back in a moment to continue our deep dive into the fascinating world of Kartik's law of inflation. So you want to know why Kartik thinks this fear of inflation could fade away?
Yeah, I do. It's a bold claim for sure, and I'm really wondering what's behind it.
Well, it's not so much about specific evidence as it is about looking at historical patterns. Think about it, ideas that get popular based on fear and misinformation, they often don't last forever.
You mean like those urban legends that spread like wildfire but then eventually die down when people realize they're not true?
Exactly. And Kartik thinks the same thing could happen with this overblown fear of inflation. As people see inflation actually cooling down and realize their lives aren't really falling apart, they might start questioning all the doom and gloom.
Right. If your own life doesn't match the hype, you start to wonder who's trying to sell you something.
Exactly. And that's where the backlash could come in. People might start demanding a more nuanced and realistic conversation about inflation. One that's based on facts, not just fear.
I hope so. But for now, we're still stuck with these misconceptions. We talked about a few, but Kartik actually identified 8 in total. What are some of the others that really highlight this irrationality around inflation?
Well, one that's particularly interesting is this belief that inflation is being deliberately understated. It's like a conspiracy theory almost, claiming that the official inflation numbers are being manipulated to downplay the problem.
So it's not just about inflation itself, but a distrust of the systems that measure it.
Right. It plays on people's skepticism of authority and institutions. It's easier to believe that they are lying to us than to accept that the economic reality might be more complex than we want to believe.
It's like that saying, never attribute to malice what can be adequately explained by stupidity. But I guess in this case, it's more like replacing complexity with a conspiracy.
Yeah, exactly. And this idea is often fueled by personal anecdotes, which brings us to another misconception, using anecdotes as evidence of inflation. Everyone has their own experiences with prices going up.
It's like that meme, this is the smallest $20 bill I've ever seen.
Exactly. And it's totally natural to share those experiences, to connect with others who are feeling the same pinch. But the problem is, personal anecdotes don't always reflect the bigger economic picture.
Just because your favorite coffee got more expensive doesn't mean the whole economy is spiraling out of control, right? It could just be due to factors specific to the coffee industry like supply chain problems or increased demand.
Exactly. Inflation is measured across a huge range of goods and services, so focusing on just a few isolated price increases can create a really distorted view.
It's like looking at one tree and missing the whole forest.
Perfect analogy. And then there's the misconception we touched on earlier, this tendency to assume that the U.S. is the only country experiencing inflation, which of course leads to a very limited perspective.
It's that America is the center of the universe thinking, which often means people aren't really aware of what's happening elsewhere.
Right. People get so caught up in the U.S. narrative that they miss how inflation is playing out in other countries, sometimes in much more severe ways.
Okay, so what about this one? An inability to explain why Japan could do so much quantitative easing without inflation. This sounds a bit more technical. What's that all about?
It is a bit technical, but it basically challenges the idea that printing more money automatically leads to inflation. Japan has been able to pump a lot of money into its economy without triggering runaway inflation.
So it's not a simple more money equals more inflation kind of equation.
Nope, not at all. Other factors like consumer confidence and business investment, they all play a role. Japan's situation is unique and complex, but it shows that things aren't always as straightforward as they seem.
I'm noticing a pattern here. It seems like a lot of these misconceptions come from oversimplifying things.
Absolutely. And it brings us to another one that really bugs Kartik. He sees people using arguments that basically assume that human prosperity today is lower than it was 20, 50, 100, even 200 years ago.
Ah, yes, the things were so much better in the good old days fallacy. But as we talked about earlier, is that really a fair comparison?
Not really. It ignores all the incredible progress we've made in so many areas. Yeah, sure, some things were cheaper in the past, but that doesn't mean life was better overall. We have access to technology, medical treatments, and opportunities that our ancestors could only dream of.
It's like complaining about the price of gas while driving a car with air conditioning, GPS, and a built-in entertainment system. People back then would have been amazed by those features.
Exactly. We need to look at the big picture and appreciate the advancements, even with inflation.
Okay, this is all fascinating, but I'm really curious about that last misconception Kartik identified. What is it?
It's a weird one. Kartik observed that people often complain about inflation, while at the same time they take credit for any wealth they've accumulated as if it had nothing to do with inflation.
Wait, so they're blaming inflation for making things more expensive, but then they're happy to benefit from it when their assets go up in value.
Exactly. It's a strange paradox.
That's such a human thing to do, isn't it? We want to have our cake and eat it too. Inflation is bad when it hurts my wallet, but good when it boosts my investments.
It's a classic example of cognitive dissonance. We hold these conflicting beliefs, and then we try to rationalize them to make ourselves feel better.
This whole conversation has been mind-blowing. It's amazing how much our emotions and biases can shape our understanding of something as seemingly objective as inflation.
It's a good reminder that we're all susceptible to these mental shortcuts, especially when we're dealing with complex issues.
So what can we do about it? How can we become more aware of these biases and have more rational conversations about inflation?
That's the key question, and it leads us to Kartik's final point, which is all about how we can move towards a more rational and productive dialogue about inflation. So you want to know how we can have a better conversation about inflation.
Yeah, exactly. It feels like we've uncovered this whole web of misconceptions and biases. How do we move forward in a more rational way?
Well, Kartik's main point is it's not about becoming like economics experts or memorizing every single statistic. It's more about developing critical thinking skills and, approaching the topic with a healthy depth of skepticism and a willingness to learn.
So it's more about how we think, not what we know.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our own biases, those mental shortcuts we all take, and being open to different perspectives.
Right. We've seen how easy it is to get caught up in emotional reactions and oversimplifications.
And that's where Kartik's law of inflation comes full circle. It's not just about pointing out irrationality, it's a call to action to be more thoughtful and informed.
So how do we actually put this into practice? How can we apply these insights to our own lives and conversation?
Okay, so here's a challenge. The next time you come across someone ranting about inflation online, or even in person, try to engage with them constructively. Maybe ask them to explain their reasoning, challenge their assumptions, and encourage them to consider alternative viewpoints.
So instead of just dismissing them or getting into a heated argument, try to understand where they're coming from.
Exactly. You might not always change their mind, but it's a step towards creating a more informed and rational public discourse.
It's like planting a seed. Maybe it'll sprout, maybe it won't, but at least we're helping to create a more fertile ground for these conversations to happen.
I love that analogy. And hey, who knows? You might even learn something new along the way. That's the beauty of open-minded dialogue. It allows us to grow and change our understanding of things.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Kartik's law of inflation, what's the key takeaway for our listeners?
I'd say it's this. Inflation is a complex issue with both upsides and downsides. Let's try to approach it with curiosity, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
And remember, just because someone's shouting the loudest about inflation doesn't mean they have all the answers. Look for evidence, consider different perspectives, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
Well said. Informed debate is so important for a healthy society. Let's try to make those conversations more nuanced and productive.
And on that note, folks, this concludes our deep dive into the often irrational world of inflation. We hope you found it thought-provoking and maybe even a little challenging. Remember, knowledge is power, but only when we understand and use it. So go out there, stay curious, be critical, and keep those conversations going. Until next time, keep diving deep.